The Santa Maria hit the reef at 2 in the morning, and Christopher Columbus died in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean without ever seeing land. It was October 12, 1492. The three-ship fleet had departed Palos de la Frontera 71 days earlier, funded by the Spanish crown after years of Columbus petitioning every court that would listen: Portugal, Genoa, England, and finally Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, who agreed only after the fall of Granada freed both their attention and their treasury. The voyage was a gamble built on bad math. Columbus believed the Earth was smaller than it was, believed Asia lay roughly where the open Atlantic actually stretches for thousands of empty miles. He was wrong about nearly everything, but he was sailing west, and that was enough. The crews had grown mutinous in the final week. Food was not yet scarce, but faith was. The trade winds that had carried them so efficiently westward now terrified the sailors, who wondered whether those same winds would let them return. Martín Alonso Pinzón, captaining the Pinta, had spotted birds and floating vegetation, signs that land might be near. But near is not the same as found. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. What no one aboard the Pinta or the Niña understood that night, what would not become clear for nearly 2 decades, was that Columbus had sailed within days of reshaping the entire world. The Pinta and the Niña had been sailing ahead of the Santa Maria when the flagship struck. Columbus's vessel was the slowest of the three, a broad-beamed carrack designed for cargo, not speed. In darkness, and with the distances that separated the ships at night, neither Pinzón nor his brother Vicente Yáñez aboard the Niña witnessed the sinking. They knew only that at dawn, the Santa Maria was gone. Pinzón searched. He spent 2 days tacking back along their course, scanning the water for wreckage, for survivors clinging to debris. He found nothing or nothing conclusive. Timber in the open ocean could come from anywhere. Without the admiral, without a chart showing where they were or how far they had come, Pinzón faced a calculation that no amount of seamanship could resolve. He had provisions for a return voyage. He had signs of land, the birds, the vegetation, a branch with unfamiliar berries. But signs are not proof, and proof was what the Spanish crown had paid for. The 2 ships turned east. The return crossing was brutal. Storms separated them. The Niña made port in the Azores, battered but intact. The Pinta limped into Bayona in Galicia in late November. Pinzón was ill. He would die within months, as he did in our history, likely of syphilis contracted before the voyage. His report to the court was tantalizing and ultimately useless. He had seen evidence suggesting land to the west. He could not say how far. He could not produce gold, spices, or a single witness who had set foot on solid ground. Ferdinand and Isabella listened. They noted the loss of the Santa Maria, the death of Columbus, the expense already sunk, and they moved on. Spain in 1493 was a kingdom with momentum and no shortage of places to spend it. The Reconquista had ended only months before Columbus sailed. 7 centuries of warfare against Muslim kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula had produced a military aristocracy that measured worth in conquest. With Granada taken, that energy needed an outlet. Ferdinand found one across the Strait of Gibraltar. North Africa offered tangible strategic value, controlling the southern shore of the Mediterranean, suppressing Barbary corsairs who raided Spanish shipping, and extending the crusading legacy that had defined Castilian identity for generations. Troops and funding that might have supported a second westward voyage instead flowed to garrisons at Melilla and campaigns along the Moroccan coast. Meanwhile, the Italian wars drew Spain deeper into European power politics. Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, the great captain, led Spanish tercios into southern Italy, defeating French forces at Cerignola in 1503 and establishing Spanish dominance over Naples. These were concrete victories, territory gained, rivals humbled, alliances strengthened. The Atlantic, by comparison, offered nothing but a dead admiral and a theory. Portugal noticed. Lisbon had watched Columbus's departure with anxiety. The Treaty of Alcáçovas in 1479 had divided the Atlantic between the two crowns, but a successful Spanish voyage westward would have complicated everything. Now, with Spain's attention fixed on the Mediterranean, Portugal's position strengthened. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and reached Calicut, opening the sea route to the Indian Ocean spice trade. No one challenged Portugal's monopoly. No one had reason to. In 1510, a Portuguese fleet commanded by a captain whose name the chronicles record only as Gonçalves departed Lisbon, bound for India, following the established route down the African coast and then swinging wide into the southern Atlantic to catch favorable winds. This was standard navigation. Cabral had done the same in 1500 in our timeline, making unexpected contact with Brazil. The physics of wind and current made a wide westward arc the most efficient path to the Cape. Gonçalves swung wider than intended. Whether by navigational error, a prolonged storm, or simple curiosity prompted by the same signs Pinzón had noted 18 years earlier, birds, vegetation, discolored water, the fleet sighted a coastline that appeared on no chart. The crew anchored in a shallow bay and went ashore. They found a land dense with unfamiliar forest, thick with timber that produced a vivid red dye. They encountered Tupi-speaking peoples who approached the strangers with a mixture of curiosity and caution. There was no gold in evidence. There were no spices. There was, however, an enormous amount of land. The fleet stayed 11 days, took on fresh water, traded trinkets for provisions, and continued to India. But the captain's report to King Manuel I described something that could not be ignored: a continental coastline extending beyond the horizon in both directions. This was not an island. This was something else entirely. While Portugal debated the implications of a Western continent, the civilizations already living there continued as they had for centuries, changing, expanding, warring, building, and adapting on their own terms. In the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec Empire under Ahuitzotl had reached its greatest military extent by the late 1490s, subduing neighboring city-states and extracting tribute across central Mesoamerica. When Moctezuma II assumed the throne in 1502, he inherited an empire of perhaps 5 million people, sustained by intensive agriculture, sophisticated water management, and a tributary system that bound dozens of subordinate polities to Tenochtitlan. The empire had internal tensions, subject peoples resented Aztec demands, border regions pushed back, but these were managed tensions, the ordinary friction of any large state. Without the catastrophic arrival of foreign soldiers and foreign diseases, those tensions remained containable. In South America, the Inca under Huayna Capac presided over Tawantinsuyu at its territorial peak. The road network extended from modern Ecuador to central Chile. Administrative centers processed tribute, organized labor drafts, and maintained the Quipu record-keeping systems that held the empire together. Huayna Capac was expanding the northern frontier, absorbing communities near present-day Colombia. He was healthy. His succession was uncontested. The devastating smallpox epidemic that killed him in our timeline around 1527, spreading overland from Spanish-contacted populations in the Caribbean, never arrived. In the Caribbean itself, the Taino and Carib peoples continued their established patterns of agriculture, fishing, and inter-island trade. The encomienda system that in our history enslaved and annihilated them within a generation simply did not exist. Their populations remained stable. King Manuel I of Portugal recognized the scale of what his sailors had found, but recognition and exploitation are different things. Portugal in 1510 was a nation of roughly 1 million people attempting to maintain a trading empire that stretched from Brazil to Malacca. The Indian Ocean network was already straining Lisbon's capacity: garrisons in East Africa, fortified trading posts in India, naval patrols to protect spice shipments from Ottoman and Arab competitors. Brazil, as the new territory came to be called for its abundant dyewood, presented an uncomfortable question. The land was clearly vast. Its resources were real but not immediately spectacular: timber, not gold; Developing it would require ships, settlers, soldiers, and administrators that Portugal could barely spare for its existing commitments. Lisbon compromised. Coastal trading posts were established to harvest Brazil wood, which fetched good prices in European textile markets. A handful of degradados, exiled criminals, were left among indigenous communities to learn languages and facilitate trade. But there was no systematic colonization, no plantation agriculture, no large-scale settlement. Brazil remained a footnote to the Indian Ocean enterprise, profitable in a modest way, strategically uncertain and chronically underfunded. But secrets on this scale do not keep. Portuguese sailors talked in ports across Europe. Maps circulated in Italian banking houses. Within a few years, every court on the Atlantic seaboard knew that land lay to the west. Spain was the first to react, and the reaction revealed how much the absence of Columbus had changed. In our history, Columbus's triumphant 1493 return had electrified the Spanish court with tales of gold, compliant natives, and islands ripe for conversion. That narrative, evangelical, extractive, and wildly optimistic, shaped every subsequent Spanish expedition. Conquistadors went west, expecting wealth and divine favor. Without that precedent, Spain's approach to the western lands was shaped instead by its Mediterranean military culture. Ferdinand's successors saw the Americas not through Columbus's messianic lens, but through the strategic calculus of North African garrisons and Italian campaigns. When Spanish expeditions finally launched in the 1520s, they were organized more like military operations than treasure hunts, better supplied, more cautious, and critically, starting a full generation behind where they had begun in our timeline. France and England stirred more slowly still. Henry VII of England had shown mild interest in Atlantic exploration. He had sponsored John Cabot's voyages in the late 1490s, but without Spain's dramatic precedent, English investment remained minimal. France, consumed by its own Italian ambitions and internal religious tensions, mounted tentative probes along the northern Atlantic coast but committed no serious resources. The delay mattered. Every year that passed without European contact was a year that indigenous American populations lived without exposure to Old World diseases. And it was disease, far more than military superiority, that had enabled the rapid conquests of our actual history. When European soldiers finally reached the heartlands of the Aztec and Inca empires in the late 1520s and 1530s, they found something the conquistadors of our history never faced: civilizations at full strength. In our timeline, Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519 to find an Aztec empire already fractured by internal rebellion and weakened by the first waves of smallpox that had spread from the Caribbean. He exploited both ruthlessly, allying with disaffected subject peoples like the Tlaxcalans and watching disease do the work his few hundred soldiers never could have accomplished alone. Tenochtitlan fell in 1521 to a combination of siege, epidemic, and political collapse. In this alternate history, none of those advantages existed. Moctezuma II presided over an empire that had enjoyed an additional generation of consolidation. The subject peoples were restive. Yes, they had always been restive, but there had been no prophetic omens, no preceding wave of inexplicable death, no sense that the world was ending. The strangers who arrived were strange, not supernatural. They could be studied. They could be fought. The same calculus applied in South America. Huayna Capac lived. His empire did not fracture into civil war between Atahualpa and Huasca. The Inca fielded armies of tens of thousands along road networks specifically designed for rapid military deployment. When European expeditions probed the interior, they encountered not a divided empire in crisis, but a unified state capable of sustained resistance. Conquest was not impossible. European metallurgy, firearms, and naval power conferred genuine advantages. Old World diseases would eventually arrive and spread with devastating effect. Biology does not negotiate, but the timing mattered enormously. Populations that had not been pre-weakened by epidemic could absorb the initial shock, quarantine affected regions, and maintain political coherence through the crisis. The death tolls would still be catastrophic, but they would not be the 90% collapses that characterized our actual history. The colonization of the Americas still happened. European states still crossed the Atlantic, still established footholds, still extracted resources and displaced peoples. But it happened later, slower, and against fiercer resistance. The great empires of Mesoamerica and South America did not fall in a single generation to a handful of adventurers riding a wave of pestilence. They endured longer. They negotiated from greater strength. And the world that emerged from that longer, harder collision looked nothing like the one we know. A reef in the open Atlantic. A ship that should have passed over it and didn't. The entire trajectory of human civilization altered by a few feet of coral in the dark. That is the nature of history. Not a grand narrative marching toward inevitable outcomes, but a chain of contingencies, any one of which might have broken differently. Columbus drowned, and the world waited 18 years to learn what lay beyond the horizon. In that waiting, everything changed.